everybody to the Conservation Enterprises Learning Group webinar series. And the title of our work today is Lessons from 20 Years of Conservation Enterprise Support in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in the Petén, Guatemala. We have Ani Zamgochian and Terry Robles from USAID Guatemala here with us, and Ben and Alejandro from the Rainforest Alliance. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm just going to put this in the context of our theory of change for conservation enterprises as a programming strategic approach for biodiversity conservation. And you'll see it here. I'm not going to go and answer these questions that we have developed from our learning agenda because I think you can see them. And Ben's presentation will be following this theory of change and talking about a great deal of work that Rainforest Alliance and many other implementers in the Maya Biosphere Reserve have been doing for over 20 years. So you can go to the next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Ani Zamgochian from USAID Guatemala, who will introduce our speakers. And I also wanted to just give a big shout out to Judy Boschhoven and Jason Houston, who are on the line from Uganda, where Judy and Jason have been doing some field work for the Conservation Enterprise retrospective evaluation. We're currently about halfway through the field visits for 6 sites where we're going back and examining what's going on now after 20 years of programming for biodiversity conservation using enterprise approach, and seeing kind of what lessons we might have learned and what the theory of change is on those sites. So a lot of the work in this presentation that we'll see today was based on some of the work that Judy with Ben has done, and just wanted to thank Judy for participating all the way from Uganda. So please, Ani.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the space to talk about USAID's ongoing efforts in the Maya Biosphere Reserve together with our partner Rainforest Alliance. USAID has been investing in the reserve and the community forestry enterprises since both were created. And I personally have had the pleasure of witnessing really mature competitive enterprises, but it truly has been an evolution in support from enterprises producing rough products to finished high-value timber and non-timber forest products. And really, we think it's a testament to what ongoing multi-donor investment can achieve. Just wanted to say that in addition to USAID, other groups like the Department of the Interior, GIZ, and several local and international conservation organizations have really contributed to the conservation of this unique place. And these are wonderful activities that combine conservation and livelihood objectives, and I think they really do demonstrate that these aren't mutually exclusive. So now I'd like to introduce Ben Hodgdon, Forestry Director for Rainforest Alliance, and later Alejandro Santos, Deputy Chief of Party for our Climate, Nature, and Communities in Guatemala program. Thank you.
So Regina, do you want to hand the screen off to me? Is that how we're going to go next? I can just jump into the presentation. Alejandro is going to talk about our CNCG project a couple of slides in. Okay, great. So I have my screen now. Can everyone see it?
Good, thank you.
Great. So thanks a lot for the introduction, Megan and Ani. My name is Ben Hodgdon. As Ani says, I'm the Forestry Director here in Rainforest Alliance. I'm based in Vermont, and I support our work globally with Community Forest Enterprise. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I'll do a very fast overview of Rainforest Alliance and why we focus on Community Forest Enterprise. Then again, my colleague Alejandro will discuss the Climate, Nature, and Communities in Guatemala project, which is supported by the mission. It's a $25 million project, really our flagship effort globally. Then we'll do a very brief contextual analysis of the Maya Biosphere Reserve to give the background, and then we'll look at the theory of change and then finally look at the evidence and impacts, the results of several studies that we've undertaken over the years, and just analyze the extent to which the theory of change holds up and what the evidence says about the model. So just quickly on Rainforest Alliance, who we are, we're an international nonprofit based in New York City, based in the US, with offices in 10 countries globally, with about 300 staff internationally. And really what sets us apart from a lot of other conservation NGOs, as is articulated here in the mission statement, is our focus on production landscapes and not strict protection. Really seeking to influence demand using market-based approaches to motivate and reward sustainability, and a strong commitment to local enterprises as the engine for rural development. So many of you who know Rainforest Alliance probably we're probably known best for the frog, and that's associated oftentimes with our certification services. For example, in the forestry sector, to FSC standards and other standards, in ag to the SAN standard, but also in tourism we work in certification. But in fact, technical assistance, what we do in the field working with farmers and foresters, forms a bigger share of what we do as an organization in terms of organizational effort. Our staff, it's a bigger share of our budget. It's global, it's multi-sector, and it's not always tied to certification. And in the forestry sector, we focus on community forestry and enterprise in the technical assistance area. So why community forestry? Well, over the last 15 years, there's been a strong trend towards increased devolution of rights to a range of local actors over forest resources throughout the tropics. We recognize and we want to further promote this trend because in places like the Maya Biosphere Reserve, we see that the outcomes for livelihoods and biodiversity can be better served through successful community forestry than in comparison to more, say, traditional approaches around strict protection. At the same time, we recognize that communities need help once those rights are devolved, right? Tenure is just the first step. Outcomes indeed have been highly variable in other parts of the tropics where, for example, in indigenous areas where titles have been handed over in places like Peru, Nicaragua, increasingly in Honduras, deforestation rates and threats to livelihoods actually increase after titling. So we recognize that the kind of support that's been mobilized in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, supporting communities after they've won rights to build enterprises is fundamental. So what we do, and I'll go through this quickly, but our approach with community forest enterprise globally is multifaceted, it's integrated. It runs from the very basics of land use mapping in places where communities are still in the process of winning their rights, in places like Myanmar and Peru, to forest management where they're just getting the basic steps of forestry in place in places like the Congo Basin in Indonesia, to much more targeted support around enterprise development, financial management, access to credit, and markets in contexts where community forestry is much more advanced, like the Maya Biosphere Reserve and in neighboring Mexico. So I will hand off here to Alejandro to discuss briefly our Climate, Nature, and Communities project in Guatemala.
Thank you, Ben, and good morning, everyone. Using like as a framework to discuss the skills all in that meeting, we are showing 2 slides quickly in terms of how it works, CNCG project, and as you know, we are focusing in 5 objectives as you can see, and using 4 focal areas as Western Highlands, Sierra Las Minas, Las Verapazes, and Maya Biosphere Reserve. That is part of our meeting today. We are used to work in terms of the conservation through markets, and can you go with another slide, please? Next slide, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to move it. For some reason, it's frozen. There it goes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. The left chart are showing. Oh my goodness. Sorry. Wait, okay. You can see the chart that we are starting the 2013 with some important inputs like, for example, sales, incremental sales, and how it works, the number of the timber and non-timber products. And in 2016, for example, you can see how it works, all of the number of the timber and non-timber products, and how it grows, the incremental sales and the total sales from the communities. Actually, today in fiscal year 2017, we promote $95 million. That is 50 more than the cooperative agreement request between the USA and Rainforest Alliance. And you can see the number of the jobs created and how it works, the conservation of the Maya Biosphere Reserve in terms of the number of the certified hectares too. Another one, you can see in the map too, that this is the area that we are working, including Western Highlands and central of the Guatemala in green light. Is it light green? Sorry, is it Verapaz? Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Alejandro, for that overview. And I just want to make the point that these results that are being achieved are really a tremendous testament to the huge effort being mobilized by our team in Guatemala and all our partners. It's a big consortium, and the support of the mission has been fundamental. To the extent that these outputs are pretty impressive from a quantitative standpoint, that there has been major progress in other regions of Guatemala, in the Altiplano and the Verapaces, but really the central pillar and going back for some 15 years is the Maya Biosphere Reserve, which is where we'll focus the presentation today. Again, it's frozen on me. I'm trying to advance here. Hang on. There it is. Okay. So background on the Maya Biosphere Reserve, just quickly, you can see on the map there, it's situated in the northern part of the country in the Petén region, which is part of the Selva Maya complex, which runs into neighboring Mexico and Belize. And collectively, this is the most important forest block, natural forest, tropical forest block north of the Amazon in the Western Hemisphere. It's the heartland of the Mayan civilization, which famously collapsed in the year 900 or thereabouts. And after that collapse, has very, very low population density for centuries by some estimates. Around the turn of the 20th century, something like only 25,000 people in the whole area. But there were waves of migration to the Petén, both incentivized by the government, also spontaneous migration. The Petén is long sold and seen as this frontier for development. Waves of deforestation, above all in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, led to the creation of the Maya Biosphere Reserve in 1990, which now covers about 20% of the national territory. So it's a large reserve. It's 2.1 million hectares, home to about 180,000 people. Huge biological and cultural value, and as we'll see later, a key point, it's very, very high stocks of high value mahogany. Sorry, I'm stuck again. Hopefully it will advance. But the next slide is the map of the reserve showing the different use areas. If it will come, please.
And we can drive the slides if that'd be easier.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't had this problem before, but it's sticking on my end. So if you, yeah, it keeps sticking. So not sure why.
Yeah, I can take it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Right. So next slide, please. So the MBR, the Maya Biosphere Reserve, is not your typical protected area. It's really, as you can see, a kind of hodgepodge of management units spread out across the reserve. So there are 3 management zones along the bottom is a 15-kilometer wide stretch running along the southern edge of the reserve. That's the buffer zone, which accounts for about 23% of the area, the total area. Then there are core zone protected units. Those are in bright green. You see these are areas that are for strict protection, strict conservation, but they're actually spread out in across the reserve in a kind of jumble of puzzle pieces, not in the core area per se of the reserve itself. That covers about 37% of the reserve. And then in the center in orange is the multiple use zone, where low impact activities are allowed, and where the forestry concessions are found. That covers about 40% of the reserve. So next slide. So just some background on the concessions. When the reserve was initially established, it was seen as kind of a conservation land grab. There was a group of local interests and communities that organized under the umbrella organization that was founded called the Association of Community Forests of the Petén, ACOFOP, which organized and negotiated for community rights over the natural forest within the multiple use zone, and ultimately won those rights using a clause in the 1996 peace accords that ended Guatemala's civil war. That's a long story in and of itself, and there's plenty of literature out there on it, but an important and inspiring one. The first concession ultimately was awarded in 1997. 12 community concessions were awarded, 2 industrial concessions, of which 9 community concessions are now active. 3 of them have failed, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They work on 25-year renewable contracts. Communities have exclusive rights, but the land still belongs to the state, and the state is heavily involved in co-management. And in fact, that's a really important piece of the picture in terms of success of the model, I would say. And yet still communities are the managers and enterprise owners. So they're responsible for management, and they're responsible for the value-added activities that take place in the enterprise, but the government, again, is very present in every step of the process. Next slide. So threats, just to make very clear that the threats in this area are intense and growing. Guatemala retains one of the highest deforestation rates in the Western Hemisphere, and it has the highest rate of protected area degradation in the Americas. There's a really noxious combination of organized crime to launder money through cattle ranching operations, obviously corruption, political instability, lack of capacity on the part of the government administrative units that are responsible for co-management and management of the reserve. And so put together, it really is a tough context, and it has very, very high deforestation rates in this region, which we'll see in a moment. Next slide. So to the theory of change, first, are the enabling conditions in place to support a sustainable enterprise? Next slide. So when we look at critical enabling factors for the Petén, for this site, or really anywhere, I mean, there's a lot packed in here. The Maya Biosphere Reserve model has many, many critical enabling factors that are really hard to find elsewhere. I'm thinking of other places where community forestry, where we work in community forestry. Probably one of the most important being that the communities have rights over high value forests. I mentioned this before, but we're talking about some of the best remaining stocks of mahogany on the planet, which is one of the most valuable timber species. They have relatively long-term rights to them, pretty large areas. You know, the average concession size is probably between 25 and 30,000 hectares. Some of them are up to 80,000 hectares, and they have rights over the full range of forest products. This is a hard thing to find. As many of you who have worked in community forestry in other parts of the tropics will know, typically community forestry is, involves the devolution of control over small, fragmented, degraded, low-value tracts for typically for protection or restoration, not for this type of management. There's also been important historic support from the government, and we say historic because that's dynamic, it's changing. It's not monolithic, the Guatemalan government, obviously. The CONAP has been consistently supportive, but there are, at different times, other parts of the government that are not so supportive. So that's both something that's been an enabling condition, but it's also a threat in the future. I want to underscore the importance of ECOFOP that we mentioned in the last slide, or the slide before that. Their presence, their grassroots organizing, their sustained activism on the part of the communities and for the model is absolutely fundamental, and is hard to find in a lot of other contexts. I'm thinking of other countries where we work where civil society is just not as strong, or with this type of organization just doesn't exist, and it can't be invented. So ECOFOP has been critical, and they remain critical to the model. One point here I also want to mention that isn't included is just the excellent forestry that's being practiced in the woods. It is sustainable forestry. This has been shown, it's been proven. We did a study last year, came out year before last, with CATIE, which is an important regional research body based in Costa Rica, showing unequivocally that there is sustainability in the harvesting of the 5 most important timber species, and we can send that around, the results of that study. But they're practicing state-of-the-art forestry, which is extremely difficult to find. It's also certified by the FSC, which was part of the initial agreement for the concessions, that the communities achieve and maintain FSC certification to keep contract viability. So sustainability in the woods is secured. The next point is that there's responsible buyers, proximity to markets in the US above all, where responsible buyers who are committed to sourcing sustainably, and in some cases specifically from community operations that are willing to co-invest. That's a tremendous advantage that's difficult to find in other geographies. To have buyers showing up year in and year out, competing with each other for mahogany and other FSC certified product. Annie mentioned this at the start. Long-term donor backing, not just from USAID but from other donors, transcending the typical project cycle. Developing this type of model really takes time, and to have this sort of sustained support running into the tens of millions of dollars over the last 20 years has been fundamental. And then finally, social capital, transparency, participation on the part of the communities. This is a moving target. It changes from year to year. We'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the presentation. But on balance, there's a good level of social and organizational capacity in the concessions, which is really important to the model's functioning. It's a critical enabling condition. So next slide. Does the enterprise lead to benefits for stakeholders is the next question. So here we're looking at the results, and the data is very fresh from a study we've just finished. It's led by Biodiversity. We're co-financing it through generous support from rapid response funds that Annie's mobilized through CNCG. We looked at income in each of the active 9 concessions to try to get the total picture and see how forestry contributes to household livelihoods. Again, the data is very fresh. These are just 6 of the 9 concessions that we're looking at here. This is for 1 year. This is all in quetzales. But on balance, forestry has a major a not insignificant by any stretch contribution to family livelihoods in the studied concessions, anywhere between 5 and 45% of family income. And that's in a place where, as you see, income streams are highly diverse. It's important to point out that there's high variability between the concessions and between years. This data will look different year to year depending on timber sales and how the concessions are doing. But on balance, we're looking at around a quarter of income at the family level coming from forestry. Next slide. Another finding from this analysis is specific to poverty. Daily forest income in these 3 concessions that we looked at shows very clearly that forestry and enterprise activities lifts families out of poverty. And in one case, in the case of Cruce a la Colorada, out of extreme poverty. Empirical data on this globally, as I'm sure many of you will know, is scant. So this is extremely important to be able to show. But I do want to pause here and just make it clear that, as much as we've focused this analysis on the quantifiables and on cash income, it's absolutely not just about the money. Again, we'll come back to this point, but non-cash benefits like access to services that the CFE, that the enterprise co-invests in, like rural infrastructure, education, scholarships, health clinics, a sense of ownership, community revitalization, and better overall governance are just as important as cash income to the success of the model. Next slide, please. Sorry, before we go into this, I do want to go back to the next question in the theory of change is essentially about, do the benefits realized by stakeholders lead to positive changes in attitudes and behaviors? And here we don't know the answer. We haven't collected. We may have collected the data, and we'll see if we might be able to find it in the mountains of data that we have collected, but it's not been a specific focus of our research. Is finding out whether these changes and benefits coming from the enterprise have actually led to changes in attitudes or behaviors. Next slide. But specifically with respect to threat level, we can show quite clearly that there is a reduction in threats. This graph is the result of a study that we did a couple of years ago with the Wildlife Conservation Society and the monitoring center called CEMEC of CONAP, which is the administrative body in the government that's responsible for the reserves administration. And we looked at deforestation trends over the period 2000 to 2013 and showed very clearly that deforestation in active FSC certified concessions is near or close to zero, where areas that are, under core zone protection that have residents in them have higher rates of deforestation. And then, of course, in the buffer zone, which is the red line that you see at the top, very useful and powerful proxy, shows that deforestation rates are alarmingly high. So next slide. This is the map that goes along with the same study showing deforestation very heavily concentrated in these core zone protected units and in the buffer zone, above all in the western part, northwestern part of the reserve. The certified concessions, which are hashed there in green, again have near zero or zero deforestation over the period studied. There are 2 or 3 core zone protected units rather that are well protected. The one in the northeast, which includes Mirador, due to sheer remoteness, and then Tikal, which is in the south. I don't have my pointer here because I'm not able to control the presentation, but those areas are well protected above all due to strong enforcement. This is where the mine pyramids are, has lots of tourist activity, and so they're well protected above all for that reason. Next slide. So this is complementary data. It's just come out. I was in a conference just last week in the Petén with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and one of their staff members, Victor Hugo, gave a presentation showing this slide. So fresher data, but basically showing the same, these puntos de calor as a proxy for fire, and showing that the same kind of dynamics with heavy incidents of fire in the northwestern part of the reserve, and the well-protected core zone units and the active certified concessions with relatively small numbers of fires over the 15 years. So next slide. And Victor also presented this really neat graphic that basically shows what would have happened without the establishment, above all with the multiple use zone. So you can go to the next slide, or just go forward, right? With the assumption that the Tikal National Park would have stayed under pretty good protection, you can see what would have happened to the rest of the reserve, modeling forward deforestation trends based on the analysis that we did. So the next slide, the next question rather, is, does this threat reduction lead to biodiversity conservation? So I sent the study to Megan yesterday. I think she may have sent it around to some of you, but it's a recent study that came out in Ambio last year, looking at incidents or abundance of jaguar in 4 countries. They did camera trapping, and it included 3 concessions in the Maya Biosphere Reserve, taking jaguars as a keystone or indicator species because it requires large intact forest habitats and prey species. The conclusion's very clear that forest management can help and can secure habitat for jaguar. What they found in the concessions was an abundance of jaguar, more than any of the other sites that were studied in the 4 other countries, which included Bolivia, I think it was French Guiana, Nicaragua, and the Petén. And the point that's made is ultimately that it's not about forest management per se. That's not where the threat comes from, but it has to do with access and hunting, which, those of you who've tracked this issue over the years, that won't come as a surprise to. But the real point is that, communities that have rights and have income and have a presence then are able to invest the necessary time and effort to control access above all, and enforce those rules to maintain habitat for jaguar. And the forestry on its own does not create problems with habitat. So next slide. But it's not so simple. So we wanted to sort of problematize, in a way, the theory of change here, and make the point, underscore the tremendous diversity within these concessions, just within the concession units. You really have 4 realities. You have the 2 industrial concessions, which includes, again, I don't have my pointer, but Pashbang, which is the northernmost concession, and La Gloria, which is in the center of the reserve. Those are industrial concessions. We're not looking at them as part of this analysis. We have worked with them in the past, but not a lot as part of CNCG, and they're run by companies, not by communities. The second reality is the 2 concessions that are long-term residents. So Carmelita, which is to the left of La Gloria, and then Huachactung, which is to the right. Yes, those 2. These are concessions that have resident communities that have been living in the reserve for quite some time, more than 100 years. People that came over initially from Mexico to tap chicle, forest-based livelihoods for generations. The third reality is made up of San Andres, which is the concession to the west, and then the multiple concessions out on the Belize border. All of these concessions are run by communities that are not resident, so people do not live inside of these concessions. And then the fourth reality, or the third community reality, are this cluster of concessions running up to Carmelita. Only one of them, as the hash marking indicates, which is Cruce a la Colorada, is still active. The other 3 have been canceled. These are made up of communities that are relatively recent migrants to the Petén. They came before the establishment of the reserve, but they're relatively recent migrants. They come from a more agricultural background, do not have a forest-based history, and got concessions as a way to claim rights to the land after the reserve was established. They also had, in general, lower forest timber stocks, and they were right in the crosshairs. There's a road that runs from the main town up to Carmelita that goes through this area, so they're right in the crosshairs of really intense pressure for conversion. Again, conversion that's tied to organized crime and illegality, very hard to stand up to. The outcomes, as you see, are highly variable, but at the same time, they do not really follow any kind of normative framework. We can't really say, if you're a long-term resident and there's good income, you will be able to withstand the pressures for conversion, because in fact, several of these communities out in the eastern reaches of the reserve, again, are not residents, and they're doing some of the best forestry, and they are under threat, especially from the Belize side of the border. So next slide. So a couple of concluding points. Rights matter, but the type of rights are important. In the Maya Biosphere Reserve, they're limited. The concessions, they have no right of conversion. They're for 25 years. This is both a threat and a safeguard. Government support matters, but it's not monolithic. It's dynamic. It's constantly changing. Long-term donor and TA support is hugely important. Can't stress that enough. Benefits do matter, but it's not just about the money. Non-monetary benefits are probably just as important. But again, there's no real normative framework that we can apply here that shows clearly to me that, I think that one of the key things that's not talked about is the threat level. That's really key, right? I mean, that's the one thing that shows up very clearly, whether you're talking about core zone protected units or the community forests. The level of threat is a very important determining factor, obviously, to whether or not conversion happens. And finally, as I mentioned before, you can't underscore enough the importance of ACOFOP and its strength. And the community enterprises themselves have their ups and downs due to rotation, leadership change, etc. ACOFOP is there, consistently provides a pillar of leadership, vision, lobbying, technical assistance, and communications. Next slide. So just quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but some opportunities and threats. First, 2 new concessions are currently being planned, which is a great indication of government support for the model. That's in a couple of the biological corridors within the multiple use zone that are not currently concessioned. That will only be for non-timber forest products. That may change, but it's a really good indication that there's support here. However, at the same time, the existing concessions, what will happen with their contracts and renewal is a big question. Most of them will run out around the year 2025. There's no real clear indication of what the process even is for evaluating their performance and what comes next. That was a hot topic last week in the Petén at the conference I was at. Continuing social governance problems, that's always a way for outsiders who don't support the model to say it's corrupt and say that it's an unfair use of land, and a small number of families control this huge resource and they're not even doing a good job. So that's a big problem. Obviously, corruption and political instability. Whenever there's a new administration, there are new threats because their contracts. In particular, there's an American archaeologist who shows up, it seems like, whenever there's a new administration to push for the expansion of a national park that would excise large areas of the concessions. There's uncertainty of continued donor support, which, as I've said, has been so fundamental. It's clear that AID will probably not continue to support the reserve forever, but subsidy is extremely important to the survival of the concessions, and I do not think that the existence of subsidy somehow argues that these concessions are not sustainable. The forestry sector in general, and this model in particular, needs support, and it's a public good. And then more broadly, the bigger picture is that that we've focused on the concessions here, but the Maya Biosphere Reserve is huge. There's core zone units, as we saw, there's the buffer zone, and to date there hasn't really been an integrated approach to management of the reserve. That needs to happen for the future of the reserve and the concessions. So next slide, last slide. I just wanted to, at the end here, recognize one of our colleagues who was murdered last year, community leader Walter Mendez Barrios, from a community in the western reaches of the reserve. He was struggling to keep his community's land and forest, refusing to parcelize it amongst the different cooperative members, which he knew would lead to sell-offs and conversion. And he was ultimately murdered in March of last year. And I just want to, make the point that people are putting their lives on the line for this model. Walter's not the first to have died for the cause, and the struggle continues against hefty threats, even as the reserve is held up justifiably as this model for the world. It's still under heavy threat, and there's a lot that remains to be done to honor his legacy. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ben, and especially thank you for pointing out people like Walter here who really do defend the land and defend their rights. And I think your presentation today to this group is a great demonstration and sharing of that work. We are taking questions in the chat box. I see 3 really good ones coming in. I wanted to make one point and ask one question. And thank you very much for putting your presentation in the context of our theory of change. There was one outcome in the theory of change that you didn't touch upon, and that is the role of attitude and behavior change, so that you can make that link between threat reduction going back to benefits. And especially since you pointed out what you think is the important role of non-cash benefits to the people, do you have any plans or any ideas about how you might monitor the attitude or behavior change of the members of the concessions?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's like, it is the big hole in the theory of change, right? And as I said, I think there's just heaps and heaps of data that have come in from this study we're doing with biodiversity now. And as you mentioned the other day when we went through this initially, the sort of dry run, there may be clear indications in that data, because some of it goes into questions around governance and transparency and participation, that may tell us, more than we think it does at this stage about attitude and behavioral change. The short answer to the question of whether we have, plans to work on this more is yes. We've just actually awarded a fellowship to a great young PhD student from the University of Minnesota who works under a professor that's worked in the Petén for a long time, a guy by the name of Dean Current, and she will be helping us to look into some of these questions, specifically around governance. That's her interest for the dissertation, but we want to also try and use her time to get into some of these questions about attitude and behavior change also.
Great. Our first question was about with the relatively less deforestation pressure in the west, in the Lacandon area. Do you have any reasons of why that might be, or if it's somehow related to patterns of deforestation from Mexico or Belize?
You mean the spot in the Lacandon where there is limited deforestation?
Yes.
Trying to...
Well, we have, Ben, I can jump in here. This is Ani.
Yeah.
So Lacandon actually benefits from a co-management agreement. So the park is actually co-managed with the government, CONAP, and with a local organization called Defensores de la Naturaleza. So it's benefited from a more consistent presence from this organization, including patrolling and monitoring, forest fire management. And I also believe that there were some communities in that area when the park was established, or when the reserve was established. So there's a bit more of a history in working with communities. So I think that Lacandon has benefited largely from the presence of a co-managing NGO.
There's also access. I mean, there's issues around remoteness as well. It's also a very remote part of the reserve. But as Annie says too, that in this western part, a sort of different, it's not considered kind of officially part of the quote unquote concession model, but out in the western part of the reserve, there's a group of cooperatives that actually receive titles. They're not leases, but they're actual titles that started forest management actually going back into the early 90s.
We had another question from Alicia here in the Forestry and Biodiversity Office. Can you say something about markets, like export, local, and how communities navigate those market up and downs and the changing demands? I mean, I know you wanted to make a really strong point that Rainforest Alliance is about a lot more than certification, but can you talk a little bit about how you work as that bridge between communities and markets?
Yeah, so I think 2 points, and then I'd ask Alejandro to add something as well. It's absolutely clear that FSC certification has been fundamental to the success from a market standpoint. Again, the concessions were required to achieve FSC certification as part of the deal, essentially, to bake in third-party monitoring of forest management and ensure compliance with management plans. It had this market effect, additionally, that has provided these producers not only just having mahogany, but having FSC certified mahogany to preferred markets, which has undoubtedly been a huge boon for them. At the same time, as I mentioned in the presentation, and what we've spent a lot of time working on in the former trees program and now in Rainforest Alliance forestry, is to support value added within the communities. And we've benefited from having really progressive and great corporate buyers, above all from North America, supporting those projects through active co-investment and actually doing technical assistance, going down and training them, in particular in the production of value-added parts for guitars for the musical industry. So you see income in some cases 3, 4, 5 times the what can be had on the market for the sale of round logs. Access to those markets really only happens for them because they have FSC certification. Second point I would make is just the tremendous amount of diversification that has happened within the concessions, not just value-added production of timber, but lesser known timber species where we've helped penetrate markets for species that previously didn't have a market, like Santa Maria, Manchiche, Pucte, and then non-timber forest products, which we didn't get into here really at all today, but which are tremendous important, particularly for women, for poorer households, Chate, Ramon, a number of other products like allspice. But I want to ask Alejandro to add anything on the market dynamics if he'd like to.
No, actually, you say all of the comments. You cover all of the comments, and in our experience, the price of the mahogany and are established just because we are promoting the value add of the wood, and the combination with the lesser known species are diversify all the incomes for the communities too. And we think that in case of the marketplace in North America, they are very compliant with the products from the concessions, and this is a key point because in terms of the behavior of the
So I'm just going to jump in there because I know in USAID Guatemala often has to reset their phone calls after every hour, so I'm afraid we just lost Alejandro in that.
Okay. I would just add, looking at Alicia's question, I think one of the ways in which we've sort of tailored our technical assistance is understanding that, on the one hand, opening access to markets creates risk for communities. Obviously, there's this kind of mythology that if you create the market, then it's going to come to them and it'll create benefits all of a sudden. It also creates tremendous risk because communities often lack the capacity to meet the market demand. So, it requires technical assistance to navigate those ups and downs. You have to walk a very fine line between being a technical assistance provider and being a broker, because, right, you have, which will never be and can't be, but you have buyers contacting you. And ultimately, the goal needs to be about building up the enterprise capacity amongst the communities to undertake those negotiations themselves, do the marketing themselves. But at the end of the day, in spite of all the risks, having something concrete like that, like a market opportunity to organize around, and likewise with accessing credit, accessing finance, can really be kind of an orienting, like north star for a community to make profound and foundational changes in how they're organized, or even around social issues.
We have a related question from Ali, who also says hello to you, Ben. And it's about, you also pointed out those two concessions, or the concessions where they were canceled, also have lower value timber species. So in other places that you're working, like in the Western Highlands, where some of the value of the product is a bit lower, does that mean that there might be anything of your model that needs to change?
Yeah, no, of course. I think, so the applicability of the model is something, or the replicability of the model is something that comes up continually, right? And as Rainforest Alliance, we're actually launching a global initiative right now that is trying to support the development of community forestry in what we're sort of calling frontier forest areas, frontier community forests, where communities are either in the process of or still winning rights to forests, because as I talked about a bit in the presentation, we know that outcomes are pretty divergent. Handing over tenure does not necessarily mean that it'll lead to conservation of the resource and improved livelihoods. They need support. So in building this initiative, one of the points we've been trying to make that's nuanced is, yes, we can look to the Maya Biosphere Reserve as a model, at the same time understand that there are very, very specific enabling conditions, as we listed in that slide, that might not be found elsewhere. And so absolutely, changes have to be made to the approach. You mentioned the Western Highlands. I mean, specific to that landscape and in neighboring landscapes in Mexico, the advantage that they have is that it's temperate forest, and so just the sheer amount of production that can happen within a much smaller land area can be a boon for enterprises. But you're also talking about landscapes that are overwhelmingly dominated by smallholders. So it's a much more complicated social picture to organize, dozens, if not more, groups of smallholders into sort of second-tier cooperatives or other types of enterprises to manage their land collectively. So yeah, I mean, it's a great question. What kind of changes do we have to make? It's really dependent on the context.
And that was one of our most recent questions coming in, is that it seems like this is very context dependent, which I think you've just addressed. I think there was an earlier question about, can you oversimplify a TOC, or is our example of our theory of change too simplified? And I think that's a question that we could keep exploring, but it's still the overall logic of what leads to what remains the same, and it's a given that all of this work is part of a greater system, and that you're continually staying vigilant to look for new threats and new opportunities and adapting your program as we move forward. We've had several other questions in the chat box, but I'm unfortunately going to have to move us on. I did want to point out we have Carl Wooster from USAID Nepal on the line, and he would like to touch base with you later on and learn about what was the time around the forestry management plans and just kind of how you did that, because he'd like to think about how he might apply that in Nepal. And that's exactly the kind of cross-mission learning that we're trying to promote through these learning groups. So thank you in advance, both to Carl for asking the question and participating today, and for Ben and helping us out. I did want to see if we could move on to the next slide. I just wanted to remind people of where they can go for more resources. Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. As a reminder, we've got a website set up for the Conservation Enterprise Learning Group. I just put the link in the chat box, and that also has our learning agenda with the theory of change and more information on our specific learning questions. We've also got in there, this is what the learning agenda looks like. What's that?
Can you advance the slide?
Oh, I forgot to unpause. Here we go. Sorry, thank you. So we've got the learning agenda there, and also we've got a wiki that we've set up, which is we've been trying to sort of pile all the information and lessons that we've been learning over the last few years on conservation enterprises into this wiki and into some key documents that are in that library. So I'd highly recommend everyone take a look at that website and get in touch with us if you've got comments or more information to add. We'd really like to really engage everybody in building that knowledge base and working on this topic.
And just once again, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Ani and Terry, if you managed to link back up with us again. I'm really sorry that we cut off right when you were talking to Alejandro. Thanks again for sharing all of your hard work with us. It's really appreciated. We do have a Conservation Enterprise Learning Group email address. If you have any other questions, resources, suggestions, I would love to hear from you. This group is all about helping cross-mission learning, and we need your feedback. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.